Today is November the 5th, 2007. I'm here at the Oklahoma Historical Center, History Center, I guess I should say. My name's Tanya Finchum, and this is part of the OSU Library's oral history program and called Women of the Oklahoma Legislature. And I'm here with Judge Vicki Miles-LaGrange, who served in the Senate from 86 until 93. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you only left then to become
the United States Attorney for the Western District of Oklahoma.
Appointed by
President Clinton.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.
This is a wonderful project.
Well, we'll start with just having you tell a little bit about your childhood, where you were born, and then we'll move on up.
Okay. I was born here in Oklahoma City. I was born in a then segregated hospital in northeast Oklahoma City. It was called Edwards Hospital. And now it's a nursing home. The building is still there, but it's Edwards Redeemer, I think, Nursing Center. I lived in a community east of Interstate 35 and around Northeast 23rd Street called Edwards Addition. My parents had relocated to Oklahoma City right after the birth of my older sister, my only sister, in 1950. And they came to a community. There was a brand spanking new addition called Edwards Addition. Mr. Edwards had built this addition of new homes, and it was probably 100% occupied by African American families. There were little 5-room houses. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a living room, dining room, and a kitchen, and a backyard with a fence. So that's where I grew up. I have one sister who's 3 years older than me. Her name is Gail Miles Scott, and she is a retired professor of accountancy from University of Central Oklahoma. It was my mom, my dad, my sister, and I. And life was great growing up as a kid. I mean, my parents are so wonderful, and they're still living. My mother is 86. Her name is Mary Lou Grenard Miles, and my dad's name is Charles Clifford Miles. Dad's 85. And they are both retired educators. My dad is from Fairfax, Oklahoma, and my mother is from a little town called Beaufort, Georgia. And they met in a little town called Gainesville, Georgia, when my dad, after the war, my dad had gone to Hampton. It used to be called Hampton Institute. It is a historically black college in Hampton, Virginia. And he had gone there in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s. But his education got interrupted by the war, and he was sent to World War II. And then he came back and finished at Hampton. And then after graduating, the United States Navy sent him to a little town called Gainesville, Georgia, to run a technical school for, quote, colored veterans in this little town. And this school was next door to the high school where my mother was a teacher. And she was the little girl from Beaufort who was down the road at Gainesville. And so they have some funny stories about how they met. And he was actually trying to ask another teacher out for a date, and the little kid took the note to my mother, and she accepted. And they're on about 60-something years this year. They've been married for a long, long time. But anyway, so they are in Oklahoma. And my mother was a teacher at her first job, she was a teacher at Garden Oaks Elementary School, which is the little addition next to Edwards. It's a little farther east than this Edwards addition is. And then my dad taught at Douglas High School. I think he started teaching at Douglas. He was an industrial arts teacher, and he started teaching like it was the year before I was born, 1952. And as educators, that was the most important thing to them. For my sister and me, they said that was the one thing that they always just kind of preached to us. They said, get that Nobody can take it away from you. Get it for yourself. Nobody has to take care of you. You'll always be able to be independent if you can think for yourself, and and if you have your education. And so that's just what was drilled into our heads. And so that's what we did. And I can remember, I was little, 53. I couldn't remember it, but I seemed to remember it, but I couldn't remember it at 2. Both my parents, because I was born in 1953, both my parents got their master's degree from the University of Oklahoma in 1955. And that's that was, you had Brown v. Board of Education in 54, and for OU, that was in Kansas. But for the University of Oklahoma, you had the Scipio case, Ada Lois Scipio Fisher's case, and that was 1948. So that's still kind of in a close proximity. And so for me, they were trailblazers as I got older, and appreciated all of that. And my mother got her master's in English, and my dad got his master's in industrial arts. But I seem to remember that whole graduation experience, but I was just 2. Surely I don't remember that. Maybe it's all the stories they've told me, and because they said I was running all around at the graduation, and everybody was picking me up and stuff. Maybe I do remember, maybe. And life was good, My parents were they were always very encouraging to my sister and myself. There was just absolutely nothing that I thought I couldn't do. And I know it was because of them, whatever tiny little thing we did, they just told us how wonderful it was, and if I could imagine it, my mother always made me believe I could, it could happen. And so that was good. But that was the Miles household.
Well, how did you get interested in being an attorney then? How early on, I guess?
Really early on. Probably I was interested in government earlier than being a lawyer. Okay. And then all of these people that I held in high regard for government, they also happened to be lawyers. So that seemed to me to be the thing to do, whether I ever practiced or not. I think my very first, in elementary school, I have a strong recollection of what my favorite classes were. We have one teacher for everything in elementary school, but I loved civics, I loved social studies, and then you get up in junior high and what do they call it? Government and kind of history, social studies. But I loved those courses. And I can remember being at Garden Oaks Elementary School, and this would have had to have been I was in the second grade, 1960, 61 maybe, and John Kennedy was elected president. And I have such a recollection of that. And for us at our family, because my parents were teachers back then, they were home by 5 o'clock, and we were all home, and we ate dinner, and the TV was always on when we ate dinner, and we always watched the news together. The news was always on the television as we ate. And I wrote a letter to President Kennedy, and I was telling him how, so this had to be 1960. He won in 1960. Was it 60, I think? Mm-hmm. And I wrote him, you remember the paper we used to have in elementary school where the lines are at the bottom and you can draw a picture at the top? And I drew this picture of him at the top. At least I thought it was a picture of him. That's what he looked like to me. And then I wrote him this letter, and I was telling him how very happy I was that he was elected president. Now, you got to remember what else was going on at that time. You had the Bull Connors of the world, that stuff. Those 6 o'clock news were very prominent in the 60s of, all the race relations struggle in America, the civil rights stuff, Dr. King. And I was a convention kid. I'm a Baptist, a missionary Baptist. And so I grew up as a convention kid, going to the conventions. And Dr. King's church was in the same convention that my church was in. And so I saw Dr. King as a child all the time at the convention, you know. He was kind of an icon for us, of course. But I wrote this letter to President Kennedy. Well, I got a letter back. Now, of course, and I got that letter on my wall I think it's at the courthouse, or it might be at home. And it's 1961. So it must have been 61 I wrote the letter, because the election would have been in November of 60. And it says the White House, and the postage stamp on it is 4 cents. And of course, it's not signed by President Kennedy. It's signed by some guy named John Dugan, special assistant to the president. And, you know, it's like about all of one sentence. You know, the president received your letter. He appreciates your ideas. And thank you very much for writing. And so I took the letter to school. We had an assembly about my about my letter. I was so excited to hear from the president of the United States. I mean, I just thought. And I liked the Kennedys. I liked Mrs. Kennedy. You know, as a youngster, I liked him, the president, and his family. And I can remember when Robert Kennedy came to Oklahoma City to dedicate, it's no longer now, I don't know how you undedicate a school. That's always very curious. But there used to be a John F. Kennedy junior high school over here on Martin Luther King. And when Robert Kennedy came to dedicate that school, there was a man from one of the large paving companies. I used to read the newspaper as a kid. I'm telling you, I liked the news. I liked the newspaper. I liked current events. And I remember saying to my mom that Robert Kennedy was going to be here, and did she think I could meet him? And I had scrapbooks. I mean, I had like 4 scrapbooks of the Kennedys that I had made. A lot of Life magazine. You know, Life magazine was physically a big, large magazine. I had all these cutouts. And so my mom said, well, we'll see. Was it Mr. DeLisi? It was one of the paving companies here at the time. Anyway, my mother contacted them because there was a little article in the paper. And he says, well, if you all get the scrapbook here to my office, I'm going to go and be meeting him in the limousine. Of course, he didn't offer to take me along. Darn. And so we took Mom and I went traipsing up there to take the scrapbook. And sure enough, he said, he wrote me a nice little message, and I've got that scrapbook today. So that was kind of my first. So that was about 7 then. And then I had a good friend growing up. One of my best friends was a boy named Charles Atkins. And he is the son of the late Dr. Charles Atkins and Hannah Atkins. And so we were about I think we were leaving the 6th grade, going to the 7th grade. Because by then Charles was at Cassidy and I was at F.D. Moon Junior High School. My school building is still remaining today. The building where I attended there's a building right east of Dean A. McGee Eye Institute, and that's the physical building that I went to when I went to Moon Junior High School for 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And Charles's mother, Hannah Atkins, she was a librarian, and she was going to run for the Oklahoma House of Representatives. And so Mrs. Atkins called me and said, Vicki, I want you to put together a group called Hannah's Helpers. And I said, great. And she said, what are we to do? And she says, I want you all to get out there and campaign for me. And I want you to, just do your thing. You can get you some little uniforms. So we had, do you remember that shocking hot 60s lime green and that blue? I mean, it was bluer than these curtains. It's like a hot blue. We had these blue and green little dresses, and they had little fringe on them, and we wore these little top hats, and we had her name around and bumper stickers around them. And we went door to door campaigning. And when she would go places, there was a cadre of about, probably 10 to 15 of Charles's friends. So we were a bunch of 6th and 7th graders. We would hand out literature, do balloons. It was fun. It was fun. So when she won, we were just beside ourselves because we knew that we were the reason why she won this office. So that for me was more of the same, and just kind of putting me further into what I really love, because I love people. I love people, and I like trying to convince people of things, and so that's what that was all about, was telling why we thought Mrs. Atkins would be good to represent us. And sure enough, she was elected to the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and I believe the first African American female elected to the House, and her career, just blossomed from there. What was the question I was answering? I've just been rambling on. Boy, you got me really down memory.
While we're on that, though, you were the first African American
state senator.
So you two have another.
Yeah. It was those two things: the Kennedy letter, and then and in junior high school, I ran for the first time. I ran for president of the student council, and I won. And I was just beside myself. And we had more things going on at F.D. Moon Junior High School that year. And I like everybody being a part of stuff, it was part of my little platform was to get everyone participating in at least something extra other than attending school. Because, and as an adult, as you grow older, you appreciate, I wonder why so-and-so didn't participate. Maybe they didn't have the extra $1 or $2 for the fee, or, and you may not be sensitive to those things then. But we had a good student council. Then I ran for, what did I run for? I ran for inner city student council president, and that was student council. There was a student council for all of the junior high schools citywide. And I won the president of that group, and a guy, where was Jay from? His name is Jay Shanker. He's a very, he's a lawyer with a law. Is he in Tulsa now? Anyway, Jay was the vice president elected back then. Then I got to go to Girl State, and I was elected governor of Girl State. I just love to be out on the stump talking to people. And I guess the other big mentor, Hannah, was huge, because think about what an impression you have on a young girl at how old are you in the 6th grade, 11, 12 years old. I mean, she was the cat's meow. Mr. Albert, because in, 1972, Hannah, as a matter of fact, encouraged me to run for delegate to the Democratic Convention. And she said, Vicki, you may have a chance really of being a delegate at 18. And at that time, I was away. I was a student ambassador, but I would always come home to Oklahoma City for the summer. And sure enough, and my parents were always, active just at the precinct level. At their precinct level, they always participated and, tried to get their neighbors involved. So I guess I'm sure that's where I got it from, because what else could have piqued that interest other than seeing them do that? Not in a large way. They were just, they would do their block, or they would always be a block captain for whatever, United Way, the Democratic Party, whatever. They were always there for their block. And I went to the Democratic Convention, because that's when, that was quite a year. Let's see, George McGovern was the Democratic nominee, and I can't think of his first name, Mr. Eagleton. Remember him? Was the vice presidential nominee. And that all fell by the wayside. But they had, Senator McGovern had created these guidelines to increase participation of women, of young people, of minorities at the convention. And so why did Hannah direct my eyes to that? Because I did all my little homework. And so it seemed to me, at that time, I was in the 5th, where I lived in Northeast Oklahoma City. By then, my parents had moved to Wildwood, which is over by kind of Sleepy Hollow restaurant, the old Sleepy Hollow restaurant, off of 50th and Lincoln. And I don't know. I remember being at the convention. I think John Jarman was our congressman from the then. It was configured differently. The lines were drawn differently back then from the 5th district. And I remember getting down to the convention, and this was the state convention, and I was told, I was saying I was going to run for delegate, and Mrs. Atkins was supporting me. Down, Vicki. And so then the first slot was an open slot. And, you had people whispering in the background, well, this slot is usually reserved for like that. Well, I didn't have any sense of that at 18. I just knew that they said there were these McGovern-Fraser guidelines, and they wanted women, and they wanted young people, and they wanted minorities. And I was an 18-year-old black girl, young black woman, who was at Vassar College at the time, who was indigenous to Oklahoma. And I said, I want one of those slots. And so I remember when I told the people in my precinct I was going to run for that first slot, and they were like, oh, God. They were like, well, why don't you wait? And I said, no, because I'll run on that slot. And then if I don't win, I can run on the woman slot. And if I don't win there, I'll run on the minority slot. And I'll just keep running till I win. And that's what I did, but I didn't have to because I won on the first slot. So I was a delegate. I was the only 18-year-old delegate to the Democratic Convention. I think I was the only, yeah. And at the time, no, I wasn't. What's the lady's name? She's a famous Oklahoma lady. Not Claudine. What's her name? Her husband was a banker.
I don't know.
Oh, God. Yes, you do. If I say her name, you'll say, oh, yeah. Because she was also an 18-year-old delegate elected. Cleta Deathridge.
Okay.
Cleta. Was it Cleta?
She's a lawyer.
Was it Cleta? That's not right. I have to go look at that picture from the Oklahoma. Anyway, so I get to go to the Democratic Convention. I'm trying to tell you how I met Mr. Albert. And I used to always volunteer down at the headquarters to, use big work, licking envelopes, putting stamps on. But it was good. And David Hall was the governor. I have some interesting off-camera stories for that. I won't make it a part of this interview. There was a man who was a reporter for the Daily Oklahoman, a veteran reporter. His name was Jim Young. He's deceased now. Great guy. And I remember before we went to the convention, before we went to Miami, and of course Hannah was a delegate, before we went to Miami, he wanted to do a story on the youngest delegate to the Democratic Convention and the youngest delegate to the Republican Convention. And so he interviewed us for this story. Well, this story was my life story, and had 3 big old mug shots. And that was the 70s. That was 72. I was, on the East Coast going to school. I had a little short afro, and I was just really thought I was pretty cool. And, it was Miss Activist. And anyway, I never met Mr. Albert. And he would always, when he wasn't on that stage, the little giant from Bug Tussle would always come back and sit with our delegation. And he'd just sit wherever, because it's just all chaotic and noisy and, at the convention. And he came, this was the next to the last night, and he saw Jim Young. Everybody knew Jim Young, hand me this article, and it was the article that he had interviewed me before we went. And he said, young lady, he said, I don't think I've met you. Now, what's your name? And I said, oh, my name is Vicki Miles. And he said, no, well, you're an Oklahoma delegate. I said, yes, sir. And he said, now where are you from? And I said, Oklahoma City. And I said, but I don't live there. I go to school. And he said, are you in college? And I said, yes, sir. And I said, I'm at Vassar College. And he said, wow, that's pretty impressive. And I said, well, thank you. You know, he said, what was that Jim Young just gave me? Well, there were these pictures on this article. It was a full page, my only full page article in the newspaper in life that was flattering. It was a full page. It has these pictures about this big. 3 different pictures of me. So it's just your whole big mug shot. So he knew the article had to be about me. So I handed him the article, and there was my whole life story on that page. And he invited me to breakfast the next morning. And Mr. Albert, you know, I delivered one of his eulogies. I was one of the 4 people that gave one of his eulogies at his funeral. You know, like Hannah Atkins, for me, Vicki Miles. I was such a great debt of gratitude to both of them for kind of letting me be a shadow at times, to just see and touch and feel what they did. Mr. Albert, as a result of that, because I was still in Poughkeepsie, and he said, well, you know, it says here you want to go to law school. Well, you want to go to law school in Washington. I said, I do want to go to law school in Washington. I said, I want to go to Howard University because that's where Justice Thurgood Marshall went to law school. And he said, well, you might look at Georgetown too. I said, I want to go to Howard University where Justice Marshall went. He said, well, that's fine. He says, if you come to Washington, you know, look me up. Maybe you can come and work for me. He said, I have a lot of young people working for me because my whole life and whole wish list of what I wanted to be when I grew up was on that list. I mean, in that article. And when I got to DC as a freshman at Howard, it took me about 3 months to get there because I didn't know I couldn't just go up there and say, hi, I'm Vicki, I'm here to see the speaker. But I was in the wrong place. I should have started in his Oklahoma office because in the Oklahoma office, it's Oklahoma constituents that, you know, take precedent. But the speaker's office, the web is a little bit thicker actually getting to the speaker, as you can imagine, even back then. And I was able to, once I said, I know if I can see him, I know he'll remember what he told me. And I had dropped, my mother encouraged me. She said, well, just drop him a line and tell him what a pleasure it was to meet him and that you will follow up next year when you get to Washington, you know. And even though they didn't want me to work in law school. And I worked about, I think it was a minimum of 12 hours you could work. I worked 12 to 15 hours a week. But it was wonderful for somebody that liked civics and social studies and government. And it was an exciting time. It was a very, very exciting time in the United States. And so I don't even know what the question was you asked me.
No, we're doing fine.
We're
getting around to how you came to run
for the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that passion was just there from the time I was very young in Edwards Addition where we lived, and I loved Edwards Addition. I knew everybody there. In fact, I want to be buried in a cemetery where I know everybody in the cemetery, all my old neighbors. The lady that helped teach me to read at 4.5, she was 2 doors down, and she was a retired teacher then, and her name was Irene McClellan. And I used to have to go down to have my reading lessons because I was pretty hyper as a kid. Imagine that. And my mother had me in so many lessons. I used to take speech and elocution lessons at the Mummers Theater, the old Mummers Theater. It's Oklahoma Stage Center now, but it used to be down on Main Street. I was in a couple of plays. One time the NAACP Youth Center was bombed, and so they did a citywide fundraiser to rebuild the building over here. And the Mummers did a production of this play. It was a documentary called In White America, and I was in that. And as a kid, I was in a couple of, adult plays. I was always they didn't have many, there weren't many good roles. Well, I say good roles, but you know what I mean, for African Americans. And I was this little pickaninny kid. I stole the show every night. Harry Golden's Only in America, and I was this little kid named Ruth Ella, a little pickaninny girl named Ruth Ella, and it was a deal with a penny in her mouth, and I stole the show every night. I got a standing ovation because I'm a ham. And so, but my mother put me in all these things to keep me busy. I had ballet lessons, and I had cello lessons. I studied at OCU cello with this man named Frederick Warner, who was first chair at Oklahoma. It was then called Oklahoma City Symphony. And I studied with Mr. Warner from the time I was 7 until I graduated from McGinnis. And then when I got to be a varsity cheerleader at McGinnis, I didn't want to play the cello anymore. And my mama said, "You will play the cello." And my daddy said, he usually just said, "Mm-hmm." And he said, so Mr. Warner used to come to our house at 7 o'clock on Thursday morning to give me cello lessons. That was the only way I could be a cheerleader in the morning. She said, you're gonna give that recital before you graduate, Vicki. And so it was, how did I get on all that? I was trying to tell, what did you ask? Oh, you were asking me, how did I decide to run? And I got on this thing about we lived on 17th. Oh, I know, I started talking about Miss McClellan. And then I went from there and rewrited. We lived on 17th Street in the 2800 block. And Senator E. Melvin Porter lived on 18th Street in the my address was 2820, in the 2700 block. And he was like an icon. He was an icon. He was articulate. He was a lawyer. He was a very effective lawyer. He was a very effective senator, particularly the first. He was there for 22 years. That's a long time. Mm-hmm. That first 11 years, because I studied his record when I was running against him. I didn't run against him. I was running for the seat when we both ended up running for the seat that he currently occupied at the time. And he probably was one of my first lawyer models. He, and then, because that would have been before I graduated from high school. And then when we moved in Wildwood, he and his family moved right across the street from us on 51st Street, which is where my parents are still today. And he was such a great storyteller. You know, he was very charismatic. He was very smart. Did you know Melvin Porter was the first African American to graduate from Vanderbilt Law School in the 60s? And I don't know how much you know about his kind of personage as a senator. Very well. Anyway, I won't. If you know it, you know it. But he was almost like Uncle Remus. He used to always have an audience around him. He's a great storyteller. And I paged for him, in junior high school, and I paged for him again in high school. So I got to be on the floor of the Oklahoma State Senate, and I just thought, God, this is so cool, And I would come home, because you don't get to page for 5 days, a school year. And I would tell my mom and dad about all the bills and that they were passing, and just, how I wanted to do that. And I used to tell Senator Porter, when you don't want your seat anymore, I do, okay, little Vicki. And I was in law school, and I used to write back to him, because he was our neighbor. We were friends. Our families were friends. And I would tell him all about what was going on in law school. I mean, I found some of those letters. I keep everything. I have my kindergarten report cards from my mama. Only bad thing she said was, she is a great student. She just talks too much. And so Senator Porter, we just loved him. Kids loved him, and young people loved him. And he loved to talk. He was such a talker, and he had such great stories to tell. And so I had this kind of expressed interest as early as probably junior high school. that Senator Porter, I'd love to do what you do. Well, when was it? I graduated from Howard Law School, and my first job out of law school, I went to Houston, and I clerked for a federal judge in Houston, a man named Woodrow Seals, and Judge Seals had been, boy, that was like being in Alice in Wonderland, taking me back there. He had been a Kennedy appointee to the bench. He was from a place called Bogalusa, Mississippi. And I clerked for Judge Seals for 2 years, and then after that, I went back to Washington, D.C., and they have a program at the Department of Justice for young lawyers called it's called the Honor Law Graduate Program, and you can rotate either through the criminal division of the Department of Justice or the civil division. So I rotated through the criminal division and got to prosecute Nazi war criminals residing in the U.S. They were almost all dead by then, but there was still a few of them around. This was early 80s. I worked a little bit on Demyanik's case. He was at Treblinka. And they were paper cases. But anyway, so I was there at Justice, and then I left D.C. in 1983 because I was ready to come back home. So then I got that pop-up of, boy, I want that Senate seat as Senator Porter's. Well, I tried to get on at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I did not get on. And I mean, that's totally discretionary hiring on the part of the U.S. Attorney, not knowing that I would one day be the U.S. Attorney. And I was feeling pretty rejected when that didn't work out for me, because I just knew who else would want to come to Oklahoma except somebody from Oklahoma. Well, now, how many people from DOJ could want to come home? Because it was a lateral transfer, and that local U.S. Attorney's Office did not have to use an FTE to hire somebody from the department. I just knew I had that job. And when I didn't, I was pretty despondent. So I walked across the street, and this is 83. I walked across the street to the district attorney's office, and the district attorney was this big fellow with a cowboy hat and a string tie named Bob Macy. I did not have an interview, and I just approached with my resume in hand, rejected. And eventually I got in to see him that day. I just persisted with the lady. She's a lovely lady. We became friends later. Her name is Joanne Bronstad, and I think she probably still lives in Edmond. And she was his assistant. And she kept saying, well, I don't know. You don't have an interview. And I just kept thinking, if I stand here long enough, he has really got to come out that door right there. It was almost lunchtime. So we talked and chatted, and I asked her if I thought I could leave my papers. She said, well, how long are you here? And I was leaving the next day because I literally just came home for that interview. And I was going to leave the next day. And I think that was probably a Monday. And I was leaving that Tuesday to go back because I had to go back to work in D.C. And what happened? He came out the door. And she introduced me, and she said, this is Vicki Miles, and she's a native Oklahoman, and she's a young prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and she's wanting to come back to Oklahoma City. And he said, well, you got a minute? I'm on my way to lunch. You got a minute? And so I said, sure. I cannot believe it. I came out of there with a job offer, and I knew I was ready to come home. That was my goal. But I just knew that, that justice, and so it made sense to try to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And, little did I know how difficult and competitive those jobs are because they don't turn over that often. So I went back to D.C., came back home a couple of months later. That was 83, and I was everybody starts in misdemeanors. I was a misdemeanor assistant district attorney, and then he had a DUI. We got a big grant. That office got a big grant from the Oklahoma Highway Safety Office. So I ran the DUI division, so I finally got out of misdemeanors. And then I was in sex crimes with a wonderful prosecutor named Barry Albert. And it was then that I really started, once I was back home and settled, that I really started thinking about what I had told Senator Porter all those years. What do you know what you said where I wanted? Okay, little Vicki. Well, lo and behold, one day Senator Porter goes on television. He was very colorful. And he announced that he wasn't going to seek his Senate seat anymore. I just, I was a little, I was thinking, he didn't tell me like he had to tell me, like it was his seat to give me. It belonged to the people. My dad used to always remind me of that. That's not anybody's seat. That's the people's seat. And the people decide, Vicki, who's going to fill that. And so by then I was committed to run. I talked to him and he said, I'm giving this up. 22 years is long enough. And so then I eventually went in and talked to Mr. Macy and said, Mr. Macy, if I don't, against my mother's counsel, my mother said, Vicki, you just got there. I'm going to tell the man, what if I want to go do this and I don't make it? Can I come back? That's exactly what I asked him. And he said, of course you can. He said, I have a feeling, partner, if you do it, you're not going to be coming back. And I said, well, you know more than I know. And so I ran in 86. And Senator Porter ran in 86. And I had to quit my job as a sex crimes prosecutor. And what I did every day of my life, every day during the daytime, my campaign headquarters was down on at the corner of 23rd and Kelly. Okay, you know where the governor's mansion is, and then that's that oil compact, interstate oil compacts building. And then there was this little rickety, it's not that nice Conoco that's there now. There was this little rickety abandoned gas station. And it was an old-timey car wash because it was long. Where you drove, well, I guess it wasn't old-timey if you was going to drive through it, it had to be long. But anyway, a long old car wash. And so we found out who owned that property, and we rented it for that summer. And we got in there and painted and cleaned those windows up and put Vicki Miles-LaGrange all on the windows. My dad being an industrial arts teacher, he was retired by then, but he was loving it because he was into his old groove, you know. And my mother and her best friend, a lady named Cam Bird, they were the campaign managers, and my mom was this retired kindergarten teacher. Well, actually, she retired from State Department of Education, but she's still like a kindergarten teacher, even at 87. You know, she's this kindergarten teacher. Everybody has their assignment, and you have to sit here until yours is done. That's the way she treated people who came into the headquarters. And we said, Mama, these people are volunteers. And she was like, how long do you have? And when they would tell her, she'd say, now, for the next hour, this is what we need you to do. And she was great. She and her friend, they were great. I had no money. I had no organization. And I really didn't have that much name recognition. I mean, my parents, Miles, they had been, you know, if you grew up in segregated Oklahoma City, when the schools were segregated, my dad had taught everybody that went through Douglas High School. And if you were black, you'd gone through Douglas. And then during the integration, they sent my dad retired as an assistant principal. They would send, you know, he's kind of a disciplinarian sort, and they would send him. He had been at just about every school in the city, Northwest Class and Capitol Hill, U.S. Grant. So people knew my dad, knew our family name, you know, that way. But they didn't know me from Adam, you know. And it was amazing. The whole thing was amazing how I followed this little book. I followed a lot of advice from Hannah Atkins. one of my first political teachers, Mr. Albert. I'll let him remain anonymous in all of this. But I had seen enough. Just, you know, the opportunity to observe people who did very well what I was trying to do by, you know, running for office. And that was, you know, to serve in a legislative body and represent a constituency. And it was amazing. The best, can I tell you one story about the race? There was a book. I'm always a person I miss how to. At any given time, I'm probably taking some class at some library or some VOTEC or something on how to do something. And so this book was commended to me. I don't even know who originally told me about it. The old Women's Education Fund. There was a group in the 60s, late 60s, called the Women's Education Fund. And they were out of Washington, D.C. And their objective was to get women elected to public office. And they had this book, and I have this book, and it is so funny now looking at this book, but it's so basic. It's called the Campaign Workbook. And it has from A to Z how to run and how to win office as a woman. And it starts with very simplistic things like, putting your life out there on a piece of paper and seeing where your little soft spots are and how you're going to respond to certain things and who's your support group going to be and what are you going to be when everybody's talking about you from the 6 o'clock news to the newspaper to whatever, and are you strong enough to deal with this, or are you going to fall apart? Are the people around you going to fall apart? How do you raise money? How do you get out the vote? I mean, it was an A to Z. It was like a primer on how to, if you're a woman, run for office. There was a chapter on incumbency, running against an incumbent, which I was running against a 22-year incumbent. Well, and I mean, I read that book from beginning to end, and one of the chapters in this book was about targeting and how before you even, sign up to do this deal, you need to do your targeting research. And what your targeting research is going to do is when you do it, and basically you're looking at, it didn't work so well for a Senate race because it was every 4 years, so that's a longer period of time. It works real well for a House race, which are 2-year terms. And so let's say you look at the election returns for that candidate that you're running against for 2 races. 8 years is almost too much because the demographics can change so much in an area over an 8-year period. So I did Senator Porter's. Actually, I just did the term, his last voting, just 4 years before 86. So that would have been what, 82. It was hard then because stuff wasn't computerized, and I had to go to the county election board, and they would let you buy Xerox, the precinct books. They were available for public view, but you had to stand there and Xerox them. God, I had to do that for 32 precincts. And so that was a lot of Xerox. And now they can probably just send it to you by email or whatever for a cost. And it was a cost then. So your targeting research is you're just really, and they gave you this little formula thing to use, and you were just really almost, by the time you did your targeting research, you had a snapshot of every precinct, of who supported him, who supported the other people, who didn't vote. You had everything you needed. Mm-hmm. And then you were supposed to look, the targeting research, once it was done for the total number of precincts, you were supposed to look at where his strengths were. And you were supposed to identify as many strengths as that you had in your opponent's strong areas. And you were going to play to those strengths in those areas. But you weren't going to spend the goal of it. You didn't have enough time, money, people resources to spend in every precinct. So this targeting research tells you how to spend your limited resources. So what I found from my targeting research was that as a result of my targeting research, there were 32 precincts. And for nearly 22 years, Senator Porter had won from only 11 of 32 precincts. That's what my targeting research following this book told me. So then I zoomed in on those 11 precincts. Well, what was his number one vote-getting precinct? Garden Oaks. That's where I had gone to elementary school. That's where my mother had taught kindergarten for, 40 some odd years. Bing, the lights went off. You don't have the same money, people, time as your opponent does, your incumbent opponent. So use resources, the unconventional resources. I said, Mama, if before this race is over, you will knock on every door in Garden Oaks. Because what person doesn't love their kid's kindergarten teacher? Everybody loves the kindergarten teacher. Oh, God, it took her the whole 4 months. I said, Mama, you got to stop going in these people's houses. Don't get off the porch. Oh, Mrs. Miles, come in. Oh, God, oh, let me, and they wanted to tell the story where all the kids were. Oh, little Bobby, well, he didn't make it. He's in prison. But Judy did good, She had to hear everybody's story, but it paid off. I knew the second vote-getting precinct was the area which is now the Health Sciences Center. At that time, those were thriving communities before urban renewal came and relocated, dislocated, unlocated all those families. Some of us who have sentimental memories of all of that feel differently about that. But anyway, his second top vote-getting precinct was that JFK area where John F. Kennedy Junior High School was over Martin Luther King. It is there now. The building is there, falling apart. But it's now Moon, and the old Moon is, I guess that's something for the medical complex. Well, my dad was the assistant principal at Moon Junior High School, and he had taught there for years because he had taught at Douglas for 100 years, and then he moved to Moon. So I knew that my dad, people that were voters in that area, had a sense of my dad, who he was, because he loved his kids, and he taught usually all boys in industrial arts. So I said, Dad, I didn't get him to knock on doors. He's not the knocking on door type. But anyway, so I knew, and what the campaign workbook told me was that, you just play to your strengths in any of those areas, because as much as you can break up your opponent's stronghold, the better. And then what you do with the lion's share of your people, of your money, and of your time is you hit those. For me, it was 22 other precincts, and that's where I directed my money and resources. I took whoever put a yard sign up for me, I took it, but I really concentrated on those areas. And it worked. It worked. I mean, election night, everybody's up there at the headquarters waiting for those returns. And they said, God, Vicki, you seem so calm. And I said, they said, aren't you nervous? And I said, no, not yet. I said, I'm just waiting for some precincts to come in. And they said, what are you waiting for? And I said, well, I'm waiting for Garden Oaks to come in. Because I knew if I could impact his number one vote-getting precinct for 22 years, I had a pretty good feeling that I had a good chance of winning. And so, sure enough, when Garden Oaks came in, his margin was like less than 30% that he beat me in that precinct, and I was ecstatic. And so as they came in as I probably thought they were going to come in from that, because that was, it was downhill from there. But that story with my mom is so funny. She was so funny. She was so, she and her friend Cam Bird. And Cam Bird retired from Oklahoma City Board of Education, and she was the ESL, English as Second Language, whatever the coordinator of that effort was for the board. And they were so funny. They were out there just organizing their butts off. And it all inured to my benefit. And everybody said, God, how did you do it? And I said, ask Mama, and I call her Ma Bird. I said, Mama and Ma Bird did that. I was just the beneficiary. The other thing I did, it was a very grassroots campaign. And if and that's what all that kind of literature says, if the area in which you're running is small enough to do that door to door. Campaigns are not won in offices. They are not won sending out literature. They're won pressing the flesh and looking people in the eye and answering questions, even though they might be humiliating, and I got a lot of that because, he was very revered and respected by many. It was no gray with this guy. You either loved him or you hated him. He was a big civil rights activist and very gregarious and very forward on all of that, and sometimes offensive to some, and Well, he wasn't. I thought he was funny. You know, I never was offended by him or afraid of him, and I think that helped too. But I worked every day during the day time. You know, my mom and my brother were at the campaign headquarters. I would go there, but they would put me on a task. I'm like, I'm the candidate. Do I have to look up phone numbers? You know, we didn't have money to buy lists or any of that. You know, she had us doing all that stuff manually.
Did you do it the second time around? Did you have to do it when you were reelected?
Never had another opponent.
Okay.
Well, and it was just one time because 86, 87, 89, 90. Okay. And then in 90, I didn't have an opponent. And then 93, you know, I got the appointment from President Clinton via Senator Boren. And Senator Boren has been another. I never worked for him, but has been another. I kind of knew him from party politics. I was Democratic National Committee woman from Oklahoma for probably 2 terms. Well, almost the whole time I was in the Senate. Lou Watkins, Wes Watkins' wife, Hannah was on the DNC. And when Hannah gave up her seat, and I don't know when timing wise, I don't know the years. Then Lou Watkins ran, and Lou Watkins was there was always a male and a female on the DNC from every state, so it was just one. God, all this is it's so kind of fading in my brain.
You're doing good. We better check on your time.
What time is it?
You're supposed to be somewhere at 2.
Is it 2?
Mm-hmm.
I gotta go.
Yeah, we may have to do round 2 another time.
See, you should never let me go and tell me to just talk.
Well, let's stop because she'll edit this. So we'll thank you for your time today, and we'll do it again.